You want to know why America is so politically divided? Follow the science. I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And gentlemen, I was listening to an interview on a public radio program called Think, which I listen to from time to time just to remind my brain to do so. And I'm not saying the program helps. I'm just saying that word occasionally sparks something. And they were interviewing a guy who recently wrote a column in the Washington Post. His name is Joel Achenbach. And the column was under the headline, "Science is Revealing Why American Politics Are So Intensely Polarized." And one of the things he said during the Think interview was that back in the 1950s, some academics were expressing concern that the two parties in the United States were so similar as to be virtually identical. And that, during the sort of Eisenhower years, they had become almost homogeneous and there were no real differences. And so, what kind of a democracy or republic do you have when you don't really have any legitimate debate? He said, now, for good or ill, we've overcome that problem. So, however, he said he doesn't think that primarily the problem between the parties is one of policy substance, but rather one of feeling. And he brings in a lot of what, scientists call evolutionary psychology into it. But here's a quote from a guy who's an expert, so-called, in this, from Johns Hopkins University, who's written a paper about this. He said, "It's polarization that's based on our feelings for each other, not based on extremely divergent policy preferences." And basically, he's saying that evolutionary psychology developed due to the importance of identifying rivals or competitors for resources. So I guess they're picturing us out there wandering the plains, trying to fight over scraps of meat. And we need to be able to quickly identify who our friends are and who our foes are. And the evolution of cooperation, Steve Green, required what one Yale professor called out-group hatred, meaning you had to hate the other guy because you always had to be attuned to defend against his predations on your stuff. Steve, in a sense, haven't we gotten to an age where both political parties want us to believe that there's essentially a zero-sum game when it comes to political outcomes, and that political operatives really exploit this tendency in us, and they're basically trying to leverage and encourage this idea that we must have a strong identity group and we must hate the outgroup?
Yeah, tribalism, collectivism, whatever version of collectivism you want to call it, has made a roaring comeback in recent decades. Or maybe I should say it's a slow rolling comeback that's gotten to the point now where you just can't sweep it under the rug anymore. It seems like every group out there, even the ones I like and kind of belong to, although I've never been much of a joiner, every one of them has to have their, who was the object of the 2 minutes hate in 1984? Was it Goldberg, Goldstein?
Goldstein.
Goldstein. It seems like every group out there has their Goldstein, and it's not a daily 2 minutes hate. It's a lot more than that. It's like 2 minutes every hour, guaranteed. If you spend any time on social media reading politics like I do, and it's tiresome. But there is a solution to this. 250 years ago or so, we had a very serious group of people who thought very seriously about the problem of democracy, the problem of a republic, which is it had only been tried before in city-states, really, fairly small, fairly alike groups of people. And even then, it typically turned into a disaster with given enough time or given a big enough crisis. You look at what Athens did to itself, and these are the problems that the founders of this country thought about very, very hard. Nothing had been tried on this scale before. That's why they called it the American experiment. Could you have 4 or 5 million people in 13 very different states make a single union and make it work? And the answer they came up with was federalism. You do what works for you in New Hampshire, and New York isn't very far away, but boy, you've got a completely different situation there. That's a big state. You got a big city and all that, which is not at all the same as either the Carolinas or Virginia. And federalism was the answer to that problem. Each of the states could do a whole you do you thing, and on a very few issues, national defense, currency, trade, the federal government was supreme, and that was the law of the land, and that was that. The states and localities were free to go their own way. Well, now Washington is a colossus, and thanks to some questionable Supreme Court decisions and a whole lot of laws and regulations, there really isn't anything that somebody with the right lever in Washington can't try and force people to do, or take away from them, or stop them from doing, which means we are fighting more and more over less and less, because the problem isn't particular policy, it's who has those hands on those levers, and why do those levers even exist? They're really not supposed to.
Bill Whittle, this is another quote from this article that I read. He says, "We're predisposed to pay attention to conflict because we might be in danger." So he's talking again from sort of an evolutionary psychology perspective on things, where more primitive groups of humans, and I say that with arrogance, assuming that I'm highly advanced, but more primitive groups of humans had to stay finely attuned to danger. And so it's much, for us, conflict is ever present because we're constantly looking for threats. And he uses the example, he says, basically, we don't snap our heads around to look at a beautiful flower. But if we hear a stick break when we're out in the wilderness, we snap our heads around looking for a predator. We're attuned to that. And Bill, it seems to me that there may be something to this idea that the science of this basically is understood by the pundits and politicians and their operatives who plan their campaigns to a much higher extent than it is to the average American, and we may be unwittingly used as pawns because they get our psychological bent and we don't, and so we just behave in patterned ways, and they know how to push the buttons.
Well, there's a lot of really interesting things to unpack here. So, first of all, on your last point, big tech monitors every keystroke we make and everything we do. And it's tempting for us to think, wow, they're reading my emails. They're not reading your emails. They're reading hundreds of millions of emails. They don't care about you. You are one more piece of data in an enormous stream of data. And they are triangulating their policies based upon the feedback that they're getting from things like comment sections in YouTube things and so on and so forth. They're not interested in you. They're interested in what people like you are doing and where they're trending. Now, if the point of this article is that the psychology of the two parties is different, there's no question about that, because the brains of the two parties are different. There's been many supported research that shows that there's a difference in the size of the brain between people who describe themselves as extremely conservative versus extremely progressive, and that part of the brain is called the amygdala. And the amygdala is It's more developed in conservatives. Liberals say, well, that's because the amygdala is the fear center, and conservatives do nothing but live in fear and paranoia. But the amygdala's job is to alert you to threats. The amygdala is the part of you that reminds you what a threat is. So you mentioned you don't snap your head at a flower, but you do snap your head and look around when you hear a sharp noise behind you. Well, the amygdala learns that if you hear rustling in the bushes behind you and you get pounced on by a leopard and you end up surviving the experience, next time you hear rustling in the bushes, you don't have to figure out what it is. You don't have to stand. What did I hear? Instantly, you know. Which parenthetically, by the way, that twig snap thing is so deep in our biology that they often put that in horror movies when the villain strikes. They'll put it just because it rings us up. So there's that biological difference. The second thing is that one of the reasons we're much more polarized now is because politics has intruded into everything. When they were talking a bit disdainfully about how there was virtually no distinction between Republicans and Democrats in the 50s and so on, it's because the discussions about politics in the 50s were about, do we want an 11% tax on this, or do we want a 7% tax on this? politics had not intruded into our locker rooms. It hadn't intruded into our bedrooms. It hadn't intruded into our private lives. It wasn't trying to tell us what we could do or couldn't do. It wasn't trying to control and regulate everything we do. At the time, Washington was functioning more or less as it was supposed to, which is to run the legitimate federal business of the government. And it's only when the government began intruding into people's personal lives that we began to develop this kind of hatred. Because nobody's going to hate if your neighbor's in favor of a 4% tariff and you're in favor of an 8% tariff, that's not the kind of thing you go burn the guy's house down for, right? But if he's determined that his son, who's 220 pounds, is going to wrestle your daughter because of the political differences, that now you got fighting words. So there's that. And the final thing I think, Scott, is, and we don't pay enough attention to this, is that there are tremendous outside forces acting on our society. Every time that you talk about communist infiltration and influence on the society, you are automatically mocked as a paranoid and a lunatic. But what's interesting about history is that all of the people like Alger Hiss and all the rest of them who conservatives were mocked for calling communists turned out to be communists. The Rosenbergs, all of that. There is a philosophy in the world called collectivism that is antithetical to the principles of individualism that the United States are founded on. And we are the last barrier to worldwide collectivism. And so it is in the interest of collectivists like the Russians and the Chinese and many others to destroy this society. This society is so fundamentally strong that we've been able to weather this since it started in the 60s, at least above board. And so what you do is you have to turn people against themselves, get the father out of the household, destroy the family. That's the first thing, but turn you against your neighbor. And the term I've often used for this is, the reason it's a false premise, this division, I call it kind of a psychological Rubik's Cube. And what I mean by that is, if I've got somebody and I'm talking to them and I'm a conservative and they're a liberal, then we're at each other's throats because I know all the horrible things they believe in and they know all the horrible things that I believe in, and I want to kill that person, they want to strangle me, and so on. And then if you take the Rubik's Cube and twist it, and you take that exact same individual and put us at a football game, and we're both Florida Gator fans, and now we're playing against Florida State, all of a sudden, all of those differences and all of those impulses disappear. Now, when we beat the snot out of these useless vagabonds from that city up north, which has been a while, by the way, now we're brothers. Now we're embracing and hugging each other, and and cheering. And so these differences are manufactured. And when you take all of these things together, the biological difference, the intrusion into everyday life of politics, and especially the subversion of the country, you end up with a and this is the good news, you end up with a fundamentally false sense of how bad things are, because you're told all the time about race conflicts and bitterness and bigotry and white privilege and all of it. And then you'll go to the 7-Eleven, you'll hold the door for a black man, he'll say, "Hey, thanks, man," and he'll do something for you, and it's just not there, Scott. It's not there. So, yeah, I think I'm done now.
Well, this interview that I heard briefly on the NPR show Think, and then the follow-up of reading the article by Joel Achenbach in the Washington Post, made me think that if we only think in terms of group rivalries and out-group hatred, we become vulnerable to manipulation of our feelings. And no matter how rational I consider myself, there is an emotional response that precedes rationality involuntarily. When something happens to you or someone says something, you can experience an immediate feeling of hate, or of hurt, rather, is probably a better way to say it. An immediate feeling of hurt before you get around to going, oh, wait a minute, now if I rationally think about this is what's going on here, and there's no reason for me to feel hurt, and this person was just having a bad day or whatever. But if we are so fine-tuned to immediately be able to identify the guys in the other jerseys, and if we are so in league with the people who are wearing our colored jersey that we know that no matter what that other guy does, we've got to not like it. And in fact, it would be very helpful if we were outraged at it. Then we suspend ever getting around to the rationality part. Our rational judgment we shuts down questions. We use our tribalism instead of our minds. And I think we scuttle this experiment in human liberty, which was never designed for uniformity of thought or homogeneity of political ideology. It was designed for civil dialogue and debate. It was designed for people to be able to come together in the public square and in their legislatures and to have discussions about important issues that mean something without having to demonize the other side in order to win. In my view, this demonization, this alienation of the other side, this outgroup hatred is a kick in the groin in the middle of a boxing match. It is because you think you're not going to win the fight. And so you have to do something to cripple the other guy rather than following your skill and your ability and trying to win the argument. In any case, I think there is a real place for outgroup hatred, and I understand it pretty thoroughly. But the outgroup that we should hate are not the people in the other party. The outgroup that we should hate are the people who are profiting and growing in power thanks to their ability to divide the rest of us. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.